been crushed in by the butt of a Soviet soldier's rifle if it wasn't for the fact that a Lithuanian friend of mine, a medical doctor, he jumped in front of me and took the blow on his arm. His arm was badly injured. So the thing is, but the forces against maintaining that system were not sustainable. And after the failed coup attempt in August of 1991 in Moscow, the days of the system were numbered, with the result that formally on December 24th, Christmas Eve of 1991, the Soviet Union disappeared from the map. It was broken up into now independent countries that had once been republics of the Soviet Union, but now were independent countries now. And that's why you now have this new map of that part of the world. Now the interesting question comes, is that why did this great hope in the socialist possibility, the socialist system, come crashing down and fail? When, as I said at the beginning of the 20th century, so many people idealistically had hopes of making a new world, a better world, a utopia on Earth. Well, I think the first way to start with this is with some numbers. This is the human cost in trying to build socialism around the world, building the Soviet and socialist utopia. In the Soviet Union, between 1917 and 1987, 64 million people were killed. These are not people in war with rifles. These are unarmed men, women, and children who, for one reason or another, Lenin, Stalin, other Soviet leaders, came to the conclusion that they were enemies of the state, opponents of the building of socialism, and they were shot, they were tortured, they were worked to death, they were starved to death. It's estimated that between 1929 and 1933, when Stalin decided to collectivize the land, that is, end all private farming in Russia, in the Soviet Union, and force all peasants to give up their land and put them into collective, that is, government-owned and managed farms, that because of the resistance of the peasants to give up their land, land that had been in these peasants' families for hundreds of years, the consequence was that to crush the resistance of these peasants and force them into these government collective farms, it's estimated that out of the 64 million, 12 million alone were killed or starved or worked to death or sent into exile to Siberia or Soviet Central Asia. But that was the price paid in the name of trying to build utopia. In China, 1949, when Mao's communist forces came to power, until 1976, that's the year Mao died. This is admittedly an estimate. With the Soviet Union gone, the old KGB or secret police and Communist Party archives were partly opened, so Russian and Western historians were able to sift through some of the archival documents and records. So that's how they have this number of approximately 64 million people killed in the name of building socialism in the Soviet Union. Obviously, China is formally still a communist country. There's a monopoly communist government there. They clearly also don't let scholars, either Chinese or Western, to rummage through the secret archives. But as best as Chinese and Western scholars who specialize in that country can estimate, is that, again, in the name of building socialism, during Mao's life, that's not even counting the people the regime has killed since then, but just during Mao's life of time and control in China, it's estimated that 80 million people were killed, unarmed men, women, and children, who were viewed as enemies of the state, enemies of the people, resistors of the socialist utopia. The other one that I'm listing here is National Socialist, that is Nazi Germany. Now, Nazi Germany is usually not considered, like a communist regime, but the fact is they were a socialist regime. The communists spoke about international socialism. These Germans spoke about national socialism. They too planned the economy. They too subjected the entire society to direct planning and control and management from the top down, just as the Soviets did. Hitler in Germany and Stalin at that same time in the Soviet Union. And between 1933, the year when Hitler and the Nazis came to power, to 1945, when Germany was defeated in the Second World War, it's estimated that 25 million people were killed by the National Socialists of Germany. And again, this is not counting war deaths, like German and American or British soldiers dying in battle. These are unarmed men, women, and children. All the kids, instead of making the the Soviet socialist utopia, this is making the Nazi racial utopia. And this includes 6 million Jews, 3 million Poles, 500,000 Gypsies, well over 10 million innocent Russians and Ukrainians who were killed in those parts of the Soviet Union that the Nazis occupied for a part of the war. And then finally I list here Cambodia. Now Cambodia was run by a communist regime. It's still nominally sort of a communist regime today, but at this time a communist guerrilla movement led by a man named Pol Pot came to power, known as the Khmer Rouge, the Red Cambodians. And they were in power from 1976 to 1979. They killed 2 million people in the same way in the ideal building of the socialist utopia, innocent men, women, children. Now you might say, well, why am I bothering this? I mean, 64 million, 80 million, 25 million, and then a measly 2 million. That's like the miscellaneous column. I mean, why are you even bothering with only 2 million people killed by the regime? Well, this is probably the largest mass murder of the 20th century by any such regime. Why do I say that? Because as a percentage of the population, this was 1 out of every 3 people in the country. The entire population of Cambodia was only 6 million. So in a matter of about 3 years, this communist regime under Pol Pot killed 1 out of every 3 people. 1 out of every 3 people. One of the reasons that Pol Pot's regime would kill you is if you wear glasses. Yes? Glasses was deemed to be a possible signal or indicator that you'd be an enemy of the system, the regime. Oppose communism. You're in big trouble. Now you might ask why. Well, recall, Cambodia, like Vietnam and Laos, was at one time a French colony, French Indochina. And the idea was that if you wore glasses, you probably could read. And if you could read, you would probably been educated either by the French or later on, the Americans. So you either read French or English. And if you read French and English, that meant you had read American and French books. And if you had read American and French books, then you had been, your brain had been affected by bourgeois, capitalist ideas that were subversive and dangerous in the new socialist utopia. So since you therefore had an indication of holding bourgeois capitalist ideas that were dangerous to the new socialist future, better to just kill you and do away with you. Now obviously not only people with glasses were killed, but that was one subgroup of the 2 million. Now there's a very interesting movie, it's based on a real story, called The Killing Fields. It came out about, it must be 20 years ago. You can, I guess, get it on cassette or DVD. It's based upon a Cambodian reporter who had been an associate of the American correspondent for the New York Times during the revolution that led to the communists coming to power. And just as Pol Pot's forces were entering the capital of Cambodia, Phnom Penh, the American New York Times correspondent was getting out with a U.S. military helicopter from the roof of the U.S. Embassy to a ship in the South China Sea. And he was planning to take his Cambodian colleague with him. But this young Cambodian reporter got caught in traffic and other difficulties. And by the time he reached the U.S. Embassy, the helicopter was gone. So now he's stuck in his country, and he's been working as sort of like a stringer reporter for the New York Times, right? The bourgeois, capitalist, imperialist newspaper. So the upshot of it is that he was arrested, and he was sent to work in slave labor camps, and almost died of starvation, tortured, and to terrorize the people in the society. The communists would, after they had killed people and dumped their bodies in mass graves, they would take their skulls, they would boil them to get the flesh off, and they would create like little pyramid mountains of skulls, and they would put them along the roads as warnings for others that this would happen to you if you opposed the regime. Now he finally was able to escape to neighboring Thailand, contacted his friend who worked for the New York Times, and he was able to come to the United States, on a refugee visa. And he came to the U.S. and wrote this book.